How's that?
Not yet.
Oh, hang on, wait a second.
Things.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to do something. What do I have to press here? Present now?
Yeah, the button with the square, rectangle, and up arrow.
Window. This one, share. How's that?
Let's see. It's yes. Okay, so that's working fine.
Yep.
Let's see, what else do we have? Just give me a second. All right, cool. So I think we're pretty much set. Let me see, the stream is working. So let me just, yeah, since we're at time, let me just start the recording and give you a really brief intro because the time is mostly yours.
Okay.
All right, cool. So we'll dig in a second. Give me a. All right. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'd love to introduce Ryan Chisholm from National University of Singapore, and he's been doing a lot of awesome work on modeling and simulating biodiversity, especially based on historical data. Welcome, Ryan.
Hi. How's it going, everyone? Thanks for coming. Yeah, I'm at the National University of Singapore, and I'm going to talk about mathematical and computational modeling of biodiversity. So I want to talk about three interrelated topics today. The first one is just a quick one about a project we've been doing in Singapore on how many species have gone extinct here. The second one is more about my fundamental research, a long-running program looking at the mechanisms that structure biodiversity patterns in nature. And the third one, which I thought might be interesting for this audience, is about potential applications of the kind of biodiversity models I work on to open world games and virtual reality. Okay, so we'll start with Singapore extinctions. If you know anything about Singapore, you probably think of it as a gleaming city, a concrete jungle, which is pretty accurate. But nevertheless, we still have a substantial amount of wildlife here. All the species you can see here are things I can actually see at my local park. This is what Singapore, this is where it is. It's down here at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula. Original area before land reclamation was about 540 square kilometers. And most of it has been developed today, but there are still some chunks of forest. In terms of extinctions, one of the most charismatic animals to disappear was the tiger. We had tigers here until the 1930s, but many other species have gone extinct as well, although there's some uncertainty surrounding that figure. And so the goal of this project was to estimate how many species have gone extinct in Singapore over the last 200 years. And we did this with a combination of historical data and modeling. We compiled over 50,000 biodiversity records over more than 200 years. This is our very first record of plant collected here in 1796. More recently, we've had a lot of records from citizen science and online journals. This is just one of a poor python that got killed in a toilet on campus here. But just to make the point that every one of these records has a story behind it. But we condense it into this big database. As I said, more than 50,000 records, more than 3,000 species across 10 major taxonomic groups. And then the question is what we do with this. How do we estimate extinction rates from this? In some cases, like the tiger, it's very obvious the species has gone extinct. In other cases, there may be uncertainty because the species was not ever seen that often. And so even if it hasn't been seen for 10 years, it may not be extinct. And there may even be species that were never seen and were extinct quite early on before we could find them. So we need statistical models to account for all those things. Just to show you what one of the detection matrices looks like, this is for plants. So I have decade on the vertical axis and species on the horizontal axis. And yellow indicates the species wasn't seen in that decade, and a red indicates it was. And so from that, we have to make some inferences about extinction rates in big binary matrix. The matrix is quite sparse, but it's big. And so we came up with this model. This is a more complex version of the model. We had a simpler one as well, but this is the more complex one that we've applied to the three biggest data sets: plants, birds, and butterflies. And what we say is, well, we have parameters for the extinction rate in time period t. So that for the birds, that'd be decade t. We have a parameter for the detectability of each species, a parameter for the detection effort in time period t, and then this xit is the binary matrix that I just showed you. And so we need to infer these m, d, and h parameters from that matrix, and then we can estimate the total extinction rates. So we have this likelihood function. I'm not going to explain this in detail, but just to show you that we're looking at the likelihood of all these parameters based on the detection matrix. And we can estimate those parameters via maximum likelihood. We have n plus 2t parameters fitted to an n by 2 binary detection matrix. So we have plenty of data to do the estimation. We ended up doing this by a 2-step maximum likelihood procedure, just because if you do it in 1 step, there's identifiability issues with the detection and extinction parameters. And we tested this out against simulated data, and it works pretty well. So onto the results. The headline number is that we estimate that about 37% of species in Singapore have gone extinct over the last 200 years, with some variation across the taxonomic groups. Right, so what does this mean for conservation? Well, this becomes more of a sort of values issue, a social political issue. You could call this a glass 37% empty situation. I love nature. I love going out and about in Singapore and seeing plants and animals. There's 37% of them that I can't see anymore. Or you could look at it as a 63% full scenario, in the sense that Singapore has been pretty much totally converted from virgin tropical rainforest to a modern city, and we still have 63% of our species. Maybe there's some hope for tropical areas in other parts of the world, especially if we can learn something from Singapore's example. And I should mention that Singapore is a great case study here, because it's one of the most intensively studied regions in the tropics in terms of biodiversity. There's been pretty much continuous collection for 200 years. This is the paper that we published just last year in PNAS. A huge team of people here, obviously, to put together all these records and manage all the databases. I need experts on all the different taxa. So we brought a lot of people together, mostly from Singapore. We actually extrapolated the results to Southeast Asia by 2100. I won't go into the methods, but we estimated that about 18% of species in Southeast Asia might go extinct by 2100. And interestingly, this is towards the low end of previous estimates. You can see these Brook and Wilcove estimates here, which were from past papers. Brook was about 20 years ago, and ours was towards the lower end. We think our numbers are more realistic, just because the statistical methods are more sophisticated. I can talk about that in more detail, but we think our numbers are more realistic. Okay, so that was just a brief introductory topic. Getting more onto the meat of the talk now. This question about what mechanisms structure biodiversity patterns in nature. So if anyone here is interested in nature, likes to go hiking or other outdoor activities, you go around, you see different species in different places. Some places have few species, some places have many species. There'll be species that are common, species that are rare. What are the mechanisms that structure these patterns, and can we potentially build predictive models to test our understanding of how they work? Okay, so some of the systems I'm going to talk about, tropical rainforest tree communities, where you can have hundreds of species in a single hectare, islands, where you tend to have relatively few species, and tropical intertidal communities, where you get crustaceans and gastropods and all sorts of little critters there, and they are in the intertidal zone. Okay, so this question, what maintains the diversity of local communities? And what I mean by this is, if you take a naive Darwinian perspective, you might think, well, the best species should win out everywhere, right? There'll be survival of the fittest. There'll be one species that drives out all the others. We should only observe one species in any given place. That'd be a very naive interpretation of Darwin. But of course, that's not what we observe. We observe many, many species in most places. And the two broad explanations for that are, firstly, that niches maintain diversity. And what that means is that each species has its own niche, but it's a special habitat or resource or something that it requires that is different, at least to some degree, from other species. And because species have different niches, the competition between them is reduced. Right. To take an extreme example, a polar bear versus something like a beaver, they live in completely different places. They do completely different things. They're not going to outcompete each other. But to take a more local example, you could have two different trees in a forest, one which lives in the swampy area, one which lives on the hilltop, and they're not going to compete that strongly, so they have different niches. So that's one broad explanation. Another one is just the dispersal.
Question.
Yeah.
How would you estimate something like this? I guess, how would you have an idea of one animal's diversity of environments?
It's very hard, yeah. And for that reason, I'm not going to talk mostly about niche theory today, because I think niche theory, you have to do it indirectly, basically. If you try to infer it just by looking at it, it's very difficult. You have to build theory and run experiments. So although the concept of niches is very clear, how you actually do it, you're right, operationally it's very difficult. So today I'm going to be more talking about this second explanation. So this is that dispersal maintains diversity. So the idea here is that if you have a local patch of forest, 1 hectare, whatever size, in theory, if you cut it off from the outside world, eventually one species would come to dominate it. But because you have ongoing dispersal, and this occurs across all scales, all the way up to a whole continent or even the entire planet, this constant dispersal of species is what maintains the diversity of local ecological communities that we see around us. And ultimately, then the diversity comes from speciation, which occurs on very long timescales. I'm going to talk a lot about this forest in Panama on Barrow, Colorado Island. I actually did a postdoc here a number of years ago. And here they have a 50-hectare forest where they go around and they measure, tag, and identify the trees every 5 years. They've been doing that since the early 1980s. So we have this great data set. And there's about 300 tree species, and about 200,000 individual trees in that plot. So there the question will be, well, what allows these 300 tree species all to coexist together? So I mentioned niche models. This is a classic niche model based on a set of deterministic differential equations. So your N is your abundance of the different species. One of the earliest applications was to warblers in the northeastern US. Put a couple of warblers there. N is population size. R is the maximum growth rate. And then the actual growth rate is reduced by this factor, which depends on the abundances of both species. And K is the carrying capacity. And the alphas represent the competition coefficients. So I think this gets to your question, Greg. How would you estimate this? I mean, in this model, it's very difficult. These alphas are very abstract parameters. These are the ones that represent the niches. And there's been 100 years of research improving these niche models, making the niches explicit. You add dynamical equations for the resources or whatever it is they're competing for. And there have been some neat experiments showing that, for example, in microbial communities, that species have different niches. But in general, it's very difficult. When you try to extend this to a forest with 300 tree species, it's very difficult to figure out what the niches might be. And indeed, I based on evidence from my research and related research, I don't think niches is the correct explanation when you have these very diverse communities. This mainly works in very species poor communities where you just have a handful of species coexisting together. And so what I'm going to talk about mostly today are these models that embody the dispersal hypothesis, that second hypothesis I mentioned. And one of the classic models in this domain is the neutral model. And so let me just demonstrate how this works. This is a very simple model. There are no differences between the species. Everything is just determined by what we call drift, so random birth and death events, and then some dispersal and speciation processes. So I have a cartoon community here with a number of species. In each time step, I kill an individual at random. I replace it with the offspring of a randomly selected parent. In a spatial version of the model, the parent will be chosen according to some dispersal kernel, like a normal distribution, which is representing the pattern on which seeds are reigning in the landscape. In a non-spatial version, I would just choose the parent at random. Another death event, another birth event, and that goes on and on and on. And the only other thing that can happen is that occasionally you get a brand new species, right? And this could be a speciation event. or if we're, depending on the exact model we're looking at, if this is a local community and we're imagining it connected to a much larger community, which we call a meta-community, this could be a dispersal or immigration event. And I've shown this as a cartoon model, but you can make it all mathematically rigorous. I'll show you some equations in a minute. So much of my career over the last, I'd say 15 years has been focused on these kinds of models. And you know, the individual-based models, they're great for a few reasons. One is they're straightforward to simulate. I imagine many people listening could code this up in a few minutes, a basic version of it. And there's actually huge potential for optimization, and I'll talk about that a bit later. The models are actually analytically tractable in many cases, so you can get closed-form mathematical solutions for properties of interest. And they're extensible, so you can build in other processes, even niche processes, and in many cases still retain some of 1 and 2, so they'll still be simulatable and in some cases analytically tractable. So this is the master equation corresponding to the cartoon I just showed you. It's now a stochastic model, so a variable of interest can't be population size anymore. It has to be the probability that a given species has abundance n at time t. And because this is a neutral model, I mentioned that neutral means that all species are treated the same. The same equation applies to all of the species. And so this is a Markov chain model, and these Ds and Bs representing deaths and births govern the transitions between different abundances. And so our parameters are n, which is the current abundance, J, which is the size of the total community, the number of individuals, nu is the speciation rate, and S is a normalization constant that actually ends up being the equilibrium species richness. This can be solved for various quantities, including the species abundance distribution, which is the fraction of species with abundance n at the dynamic equilibrium. And the gray bars here show the species abundance distribution for those 300 trees in the Panama plot that I mentioned. And the blue curve shows the fit from the neutral model with a 95% confidence interval. And in this fit here, there are actually no free parameters, right? So this is a pure prediction. So that's, for ecology, that's pretty amazingly good. That kind of fit. We don't see that such good fits to data, especially with no free parameters in ecology. And this is quite surprising in a way, because it's throwing out everything we know about niches of these trees, all their resource requirements. You know, there's many papers studying these trees and their different properties, and yet with the very simple individual-based models with no species differences, just some dispersal from an outside community, we can get this distribution. You can have fully spatial versions of this model. Remember, I mentioned that what I mean by that is the rule you use to choose the parent. James O'Dwyer from the University of Illinois has worked a lot on this. This is a paper he published with Stephen Cornell a few years ago. And he's a former physicist, and he imported techniques from statistical field theory to study this. And so you can see he has this structurally similar equation to what I showed you before, but it's a bit more complicated with these diffusion terms to account for the fact that now we have explicit space. And the key parameters are sigma squared, which governs the variances of the dispersal distances, and nu is the speciation rate again, and B is the birth and death rate. He actually solved this for the species area curve, so the number of species expected at the dynamic equilibrium in an area A. And it looks complicated, but it just involves these same parameters again, along with rho, which is the density of individuals per unit area, and I and K, which are modified Bessel functions. What was nice about this is it actually fits empirical data, again, very well. It exhibits this triphasic shape. So this is a species area curve for birds of the world, going from a small patch in Ohio somewhere up to the entire world on a log-log scale. You get this triphasic shape, which was observed 60 years ago by a guy called Preston. And it fits this very well. We showed this in a recent paper. We fit James's model to these data in a recent paper. And there are three fitted parameters here: the sigma, which is the dispersal distance, the rho, which is the density of individuals per unit space, and nu, which is the speciation rate. So they're fitted, but the fitted values are actually biologically sensible. So this would say that the average bird moves about 400 meters from its place of birth to its place of reproduction, and that there are about 500 birds per square kilometer. Speciation rate's a bit hard to pin down empirically, but they should definitely be small. Okay, so I've shown you a couple of the big successes of these neutral models here. There are cases where they don't do so well, which I could show you. I don't want to pretend that neutral models can explain everything, but I think.
Oh, question.
Yeah.
Pedro, you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I found it interesting that I think if I understand correctly, these models have nothing in there that talk about natural selection or evolution, right? Like there's nothing that says this species is better than this one.
Nothing.
Right?
Nothing.
And still you're able to reproduce empirical data well. So what does that mean? How do you interpret this? Like,
yeah, I mean,
is natural selection not a factor in determining how many trees are there in a certain location, for example?
I mean, that's an area of huge debate, and I don't want to take up too much time with that. But I think, there are many cases where this doesn't provide good predictions as well. Right? I'm presenting two of the classic examples where it does do well, but there are cases where it doesn't do well. Like if we look at the temporal fluctuations in species abundances, like how much a species changes in abundance over a period of 5 to 10 years, this model does very poorly. Right? So there we do need some sort of natural selection. But the way we think of this is kind of like an ideal gas theory for ecology. Ideal gas theory makes all these assumptions about molecules having zero size and not interacting with each other. And nevertheless, it does very well under certain conditions. In other conditions, you need to go beyond that. You need to consider the molecule sizes and the interactions. And so that's a rough analogy, but I think what this is saying here is that many of those details about natural selection and species differences, they're real and they exist, but maybe they're not what's driving these coarse, broad-scale biodiversity patterns. You have, and we have some papers showing how you can use mean field approaches to sort of, you're averaging your interactions across hundreds of species, and what you get from that is effectively a neutral model, right? So many of those natural selection parameters, they average out across different species, and you end up with a model that is effectively neutral. In other cases, you still need to retain all those species differences to get them through. But I think what's even.
I was going to say then, I think you said then something like on a coarse scale. When you say coarse, you mean in time?
Yeah, I mean,
in terms of number of species and in space.
Yeah, if you just look at something like this species area curve, where you're aggregating over large areas of many species, here the neutral model is providing you a pretty good fit to data. But if you go to the forest and you say, I want to know exactly which species is going to grow in this patch right here, then you would obviously need to look at niches. Mm-hmm. But if you just want to know how many species there are in this area of 50 hectares or whatever you're looking at, maybe you don't need to consider all the details of the species and their niches and the differences between them.
All right, thank you.
And I just wanted to say one more thing. I think what's perhaps even more important than these particular predictions I've shown you is that this is a predictive theory. It makes falsifiable predictions. Sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're right. But we know that falsifiable predictions are a cornerstone of science, and this allows us to move forward. Whereas many of these niche models, they make intuitive sense, but actually generating predictions from them that you can test is difficult, or in some cases the predictions are trivial, or in many cases people just don't test them, right? So what's really nice about neutral theory is that it made testable predictions, and people went and tested them against data, and as I said, sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Okay, so back to this question: what maintains the diversity of local communities? Do niches maintain diversity? Well, there are some nice experimental studies that I didn't show you, and some observational studies which strongly suggest that yes, niches do maintain diversity, especially in species-poor systems. And we just have a handful of species. They're most likely co-occurring because they use different niches. Dispersal maintains diversity. Evidence from fits of neutral models and related models to broad statistical patterns. So it seems that this second hypothesis is more applicable when you get to species-rich systems and larger scales. This is known as MacArthur's paradox, because MacArthur, an ecologist who was active about half a century ago but died young, he made major contributions to both of these branches of research, but never really explained himself how they could be reconciled. And of course, as I said, it's not that one's wrong and one's right. They may be more wrong or more right in different contexts. I want to show you one way of potentially incorporating niches into these kinds of model species differences. This is probably the simplest way you can do it. You just allow species to have completely separate niches. So I've just colored the squares in this cartoon with red, green, blue, and black, representing different niches. And I'm going to have a rule that each species can live in one and only one niche, right? So you can get multiple species per niche, but the species can't jump outside its niche. We've also studied this model. This actually goes back to a paper from Drew Purvis, who some of you may know. He works at DeepMind now, I think. And here we looked at what happens is you change the speciation rate, what happens to your species richness, the number of species. In the neutral model, your species richness just drops to 1 as your speciation rate approaches 0. But in this hybrid model where we added some niches, the species richness drops to a lower bound, which is the number of niches. It's pretty obvious why that happens. I essentially forced it to do that. But this model is conceptually interesting because it just shows you how you can potentially get this transition from a niche structured system to a system that's structured by speciation or dispersal as you increase the diversity. And this was purely a theoretical paper, but some years afterwards I was browsing through a classic book by MacArthur and Wilson on island biogeography, and I saw this graph. Right, this is from this is a number of plants on islands in the Kapinga-Marangi Atoll in the Pacific, and what you can see, so each point here is an island, and what you can see is a kind of biphasic shape, qualitatively similar to what I showed you on that previous graph, but now we have area here. But as soon as I saw this, I said, hey, I'm pretty sure I know what's driving this, but you have to reinterpret area here, not as speciation, but as immigration. So bigger areas have higher, bigger islands will have more immigration. This effect here, so usually species area curves are increasing, but this anomalous pattern where you get a flat species area curve was called the small island effect. And no one really had a good explanation of it at the time. Okay, so how I'm imagining this to work is you have a small island with a number of niches. A small island has low immigration because it provides a small target for seeds to land on. Your number of species will just be approximately equal to your number of niches. So you're in that niche structured regime. But if you have a larger island, you have high immigration, and your number of species will be more than your number of niches. So I don't expect you to count all the little icons here, but there's actually 10 species and only 6 niches. And again, we have mathematical representations of this model. We managed to solve it for the island species area curve because there's a mathematical formula involving digamma functions. And our 3 free parameters are just the number of niches, the per capita immigration rate, and theta, which is a parameter representing the meta-community diversity, so the diversity of wherever those propagules, the seeds, are coming from. We fit this to 100 different island data sets, and we got very good fits. Much better than people had gotten before with purely phenomenological models, that people had fitted breakpoint models and so on. And so we said, well, this is a good explanation for this phenomenon, that we have niche assembly on these very small islands that are receive very little immigration, and dispersal assembly elsewhere. So that was nice. That's the conclusion I just mentioned. Some weaknesses of this are that it relies purely on observational data, so there could be other interpretations. And related to that, a potential confounding variable is island area. So what we're saying is that the driving factor is immigration, and island area is mediating that. But there are potentially other things that could be changing with island area, like niche diversity, for example. And so we went back and made the theory a bit more explicit. We said, well, really what's important is immigration rate. And under pure niche assembly theory, the immigration rate shouldn't have any effect on species richness. Under pure dispersal assembly theory, immigration rate should have a monotonically increasing effect on species richness. MacArthur and Wilson's way of unifying that was to say that dispersal assembly applies only where immigration rates are very low and you can't fill the niches, and for high immigration rates, you have niche assembly. Under our novel unified theory, we said the opposite. We said niche assembly applies where immigration is very low, and dispersal assembly applies when you have enough immigration to sort of overwhelm the niches and provide more than one species per niche at the dynamic equilibrium. And we wanted to do an experiment on this. Very difficult to do experiments on real islands, but this is where Lynette Loke came in. She was a postdoc here. She's now a lecturer at the University of Melbourne. And she did an experiment, not with real islands, but with these boxes that she put out around seawalls in Singapore. And she has a concrete tile here where all the little animals can live on, gastropods, crustaceans, and so on. And she could punch holes in the polycarbonate panels here to control the rate of immigration. And I should say most of the time these boxes are submerged. This photos is when they're above water. Most of the time they're submerged so that animals can move in and out. And so she had 60 replicates, she had 12 different treatments and 5 replicates in each treatment, and ran this whole experiment for a year, a lot of work out on these seawalls. These are some of the creatures she found. And just to remind you, these are the 2 hypotheses, the classic unified theory, novel unified theory, and we're looking at how the immigration rate, number of holes in Lynette's experiment, mediates species richness. And this is what she found. She found that the novel model was a much better fit. So both of these panels show exactly the same data, but in the first panel, we're fitting the classic model. You can see the classic model fails to predict this flattening of the species curve for low immigration. And moreover, we don't observe any flattening as we go to high immigration, as the classic model would predict. All right, so this was quite nice. We published this in Nature just last year. The main implication, the takeaway message, is that most ecological communities appear to have few niches and are primarily dispersal assembled. And that's the paper. You know, I don't pretend this is the last word on this, but I think this was a really nice combination of theory and experiment, and was quite enlightening in terms of what processes maintain diversity. Okay, so for the last
question,
yeah,
just to highlight the island thing. So I mean, in this context, the islands, I assume you just simply have several niches. Like
that's right.
I'm gathering from you like 4 or 5, like
that's right.
Coast, inland, and a couple of others.
Yep.
And small islands, these few niches dominate. Big islands, there's just a lot of within each niche.
That's right. Yep.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep. In terms of finding those niches, you know, it's not that trivial, but we can count them by doing these kinds of experiments and observations. And there may be niches. You know, we're looking at niches within a taxonomic group, so niches for trees or for intertidal organisms, intertidal animals. But if you consider the niches for plants on those seawalls, there may be a number of niches for the algae as well.
So is there any way of inferring the count or the shape of these niches from the data?
You know, we're looking at that. Lynette wants to do some follow-up experiments to look at that. And my short answer is yes, you can do it, but it's not trivial.
That makes sense. Oh, there's another question on the call.
Another question, you said?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question just following your comments about the niches, whether you include the biological niche factors into the counting of niches. For example, if we are talking about the bare island without any animals or plants or microbials on the island, then we can probably only calculate the heat factor and the nutrients on the island and define niches in this way. But once there are dispersals of animals, plants, microbials on the island, they create new niches for the following. Yeah, and so
that's true. Yeah, look, you're exactly right, and so it's you know, niches are quite complicated. We've treated them purely phenomenologically in our models and just said, well, there's a number of them, you know, at any given time. But I think that the problem with niches is it's very difficult. If you ask 10 different ecologists, what are the niches in the system, they'll all give you 10 different answers. And so I think we need a more systematic way to count niches. And you're right, it's not a static thing. You can have you know, new species come in and they create more niches. But one thing we've provided with our work is potentially a way to count the niches, because you can look at where that curve is as the immigration asymptotes towards zero. You can look at where the curve is stabilizing, so you can potentially count the number of niches, and that's a first step to making this concept of niches more rigorous. You know, niches is something we can all understand intuitively and have a verbal definition, but if you actually try to count them, it's difficult. So we would like to have some tools that enable us to detect and identify these niches in a non-arbitrary way.
And it actually suggests, maybe I'm simplifying it down, that whatever that asymptote is, that's literally the number of. There's going to be one species per niche, because if there was any more than one species per niche, then
that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
It'd be lower.
Yep. Yep. It's like a niche detector.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go into this third part now, which is something more new and speculative, and that's application of biodiversity models to gaming, in particular, these kinds of models, individual-based models that I've been talking about. So how is biodiversity currently done in games? This is a tool, Microverse for Unity. Here, the biodiversity is laid out using a combination of hand tools, so you can identify areas. They call them biomes with these splines, and you say which species lives there. There'll be a combination of that and some noise, some simple rules for species A occludes, they say, occludes species B, and that's about it. With the Unreal Engine, it's something similar. You can designate areas that are suitable for shrubs versus grass, and then you have some noise functions which determine the actual distribution, gives you a bit of clustering, randomness, can produce some quite nice patterns. Some of you, and these two examples I've shown you are just small landscapes. These are pre-designed, and then you have a game that runs on that landscape. Some of you may be familiar with this game, No Man's Sky, from several years ago. This is a big deal because you have this procedural universe where you could explore a practically infinite number of planets, and each planet has its own biodiversity. Here, from what I can tell from playing the game a bit and seeing some talks by the developers online, again, it's a combination of noise and species habitat association. So this species lives on the ridge, this species lives in the flat areas, and so on. Again, produces some quite nice effects. I said there's a summary of how the current methods work. And so the kind of patterns you can get from these methods are spatial clustering, which you can see very clear here. There's some clustering, and you get niche association. So different species preferring different habitats, and they're both things we observe in nature. So you get patterns which, at least to some degree, look a bit realistic. But if we want to go beyond this and think how we might make things a bit more realistic, let's think about what kinds of patterns we observe in nature. So this is the Panama plot again that I mentioned, 50 hectares, where they go and count all the trees every 5 years. And this is the distribution of 4 of the species in the plot. There's 300 of them, but I'm just showing 4 here. Immediately, you can see some patterns. This species, Gustavia superba, prefers this young forest area up here, but it does still occur in other places. This magenta species, Socratia exoriza, prefers the old forest in the low plateau, but it's more clustered towards the left of the plot. So you can see the clustering and niche associations here. You can also see some turnover as you walk across the plot. The magenta species is quite common to the west, but not so common to the east, for example. Okay, so we have the spatial clustering and niche associations. We also have spatial turnover. That's actually exemplified by the species area curve I showed you here. You don't stop seeing new species just when you've observed all the habitats. Right? At any scale, if you increase your area, you'll observe more species. So you get this turnover. A few species are rare. A few species are common. Most are rare. I showed this graph earlier of the species abundance distribution. Congruence with geographical barriers. Right. I just want to talk about what I mean by that. This is another Panama example. For people who have been snorkeling, diving, you might have been to the Caribbean. If you go snorkeling here, you'll see a bunch of fish, like this porkfish. But if you cross the Panama Isthmus, which arose a few million years ago, which is a short time in terms of evolution, you see another bunch of species of fish, but they're sister species of the ones in the Caribbean. Okay, because these species are separated by a few million years of evolution. And so you have a discontinuity in the biodiversity here. This isthmus of Panama acts as a barrier to dispersal. And so you observe different species on either side, even though the distance is quite short. And so that's something we might want to see in biodiversity simulations. Diversity gradients, latitudinal, altitudinal are two of the most widely known ones. Latitudinal biodiversity gradient just means that we have more species in the tropics. Right? This is for terrestrial vertebrates. You can see that very clearly here. There's more species in, say, the Amazon or in Southeast Asia, where I am, than there are in temperate zones. Okay, so we might want to get all these things from a decent biodiversity simulator. But as I mentioned, these current methods for doing it in games and simulations only give you the first two. That may be okay for some applications, but I think in particular some of these things like geographical barriers, if in a big open world game you cross an ocean, if you live in North America and you go to Australia, you're going to see different species. You're going to see kangaroos and koalas instead of deer and bears. That's something you would not currently get from these methods for decorating simulated landscapes with biodiversity. Okay, so my proposal is to use these simple individual-based ecological models to do this. In terms of technical requirements, I've said what we want the outputs to be. The technical requirements, we'd like to have arbitrarily large landscapes so we can apply this to games like No Man's Sky. And that means we can't just pre-generate everything. By definition, these things are so large that you can't just save them to disk. Self-consistency, what I mean by that is if a player starts at location A and goes to location B, and another player goes in the opposite direction, they should observe the same biodiversity in the same place, which would be trivial if it were pre-generated, but it's not trivial if you're generating this on the fly. And player A doesn't even know about player B's location, doesn't even know that exists, and even all the details of it when he spawns. We'd like to have arbitrary landscape geometries, so potentially spherical or other shapes, so we could do planets. Runtime generation, so we want it to be fast. And we need that obviously when we're doing these open world games, but even for the smaller games, those screenshots I showed you from the tools for Unity and Unreal, something that they emphasize in those videos is that now you can see, the designer can see the changes in real time while they're making edits. And so even in those kinds of games, it could be desirable to have this being generated at runtime, at least very fast, so the designer doesn't have to wait to see the changes after they make them. Okay, so I'm going to use one of these individual-based biodiversity models, similar to what I showed you earlier today. And the inputs are going to be a terrain geometry with niche classification. I'm going to use rock, sand, grass, snow, and water. I'm going to have an organism density parameter for each niche, rho I, a dispersal parameter sigma, and a function that describes speciation rate versus latitude, so nu as a function of latitude. And I'm going to get all these things out of it that I talked about. Okay, and to do this, it needs to be really fast. When I showed you that individual-based simulation earlier, I just did it forwards in time, which is the naive way to do it. But it's actually much, much faster to run it backwards in time using these coalescence algorithms. These were originally developed for population genetics to study gene frequencies changing in a population. James Rosendale in 2008 imported this to ecology to study biodiversity models. The idea here is that you have a sample area, so of 7 individuals here. You don't know their species identities at first, but you trace the system backwards in time. So instead of a death followed by a birth, you have an unbirth followed by an undeath. And when 2 lineages end up in the same spot at the same time, you say they coalesce, they have the same ancestor. And when all the lineages coalesce, or when all your remaining lineages terminate in speciation events, you've finished. So here, this lineage terminated in a speciation event, this purple triangle. So we know at that point that B and C have the identity of a purple triangle. And these are extremely efficient. This was James's paper from 2008. And the naive forward and science simulations are up the top here. The coalescent simulations are in green down the bottom here. And they're orders of magnitude faster. This is simulation time in seconds on a log scale. So they're much, much faster. And since then, we've done numerous follow-ups to this. We've optimized this in different ways, studied different properties of it, made different software packages for doing it. But the main takeaway is that the coalescence methods are very, very, very fast. And they're exact. This is not an approximation. This is an exact simulation method. It will give you the same statistical distribution of results as the forwards in time method. All right, so let me show you a demo of this now. So we're on a planet here. We're starting this local region where there's 25 species generated by this algorithm. And as we move across the landscape, you'll notice a few things. Firstly, you have some very common species like this cyan species with a hexagonal profile. And you have other species that are much rarer. As you keep moving through the landscape, eventually you see some new species popping up. These are these white, I've highlighted them in white here. We've picked up 2 new species. because we've traveled about 90 meters from our original location. And as we keep moving through the landscape, we'll pick up more and more species. We'll get that turnover. You could traverse this at ground level. It'd take you about a day. We're going 100 kilometers away from our original location. And what you'll see here, even though we haven't actually generated all that biodiversity in between, when we get to this new location, you'll see that a fraction of the species is still consistent with our original location. So 11 of 42 are shared with our original location. The new ones are highlighted in white. So we've got a lot of many more new species now. Right, similar to what you'd observed if you traveled 100 kilometers on Earth. And if we go to this grassy niche, we see all brand new species because we didn't have a grassy niche in our original location. Okay, so just going in to check out this little glade here. Our next journey we're going to take is to a site that's over 1,000 kilometers away. And again, you could traverse this at ground level if you had, I don't know, a week or so, a couple of weeks to do it. And you could observe consistent changes in biodiversity across the landscape as you go to this new location. Right, so we're 1,270 kilometers away. And we've got all brand new species here. Right? And on Earth, if you went more than 1,000 kilometers away, depending exactly where you go and which direction, you would quite possibly not observe any species in common with your original location. Okay, so from that initial simulation, I showed you that we get this spatial turnover in addition to the patterns that we got from the existing methods. We get the spatial turnover and we get the skewed species abundance distribution. But now I want to look at the congruence of geographical barriers. So I'm going to take a trip in the opposite direction here. I'm going to go out across the ocean to this island, and I'm traveling a shorter distance now. So I'm going less than 100 kilometers, but because there's this ocean barrier to dispersal, we observe all new species on this island. Okay, so we're much closer than we were when we went on that first journey, but we're seeing more turnover in biodiversity because of the ocean barrier to dispersal. Okay, and just to make this point about geographical barriers more explicit, I ran this other demo where we're sitting on a patch of land that's stationary, and we're dropping the elevation of the surrounding terrain, and we're rerunning the evolutionary algorithm every single frame. And initially, you don't see much. You see a bit of flickering of species identities as the evolutionary paths are forced to sort of reroute around the landscape due to idiosyncratic changes in the terrain. But eventually, when the terrain gets low enough that large parts of it are submerged underwater, those evolutionary paths get diverted to a much greater extent, and you see bigger changes. So you'll start to see species disappearing, new species coming in, and the overall trend is for species richness to drop because the surrounding landscape is less permeable to dispersal. So the local area is unable to draw on such a large region as it was before for dispersal. So by the time I get to the end of the simulation here, there's only 4 species left in this local area, whereas we had 16 originally. I just want to run a slightly different version of this, where now I have 2 patches that I'm not subsiding. And before I do the subsiding, those 2 areas are connected to some degree, so they share some species in common. So if I go to the second area, I share 7 out of my 17 species with the original location. They're 4 kilometers away. But if now I do the terrain subsidence, well, first of all, there's only 4 species in the original location. If I go to the second location, I have 6 species and none of them are shared, right? So I've decreased the diversity of both locations by dropping the surrounding terrain, but I've also largely disconnected them by lowering the dispersal across the intervening landscape. Here's another demo showing what I mean by the geographical barriers to dispersal. So I've created this ring island, and if you look around the ring, you can see gradual changes in biodiversity as we move around it. That's fine, but what I'm going to do is create a canal up the top there, which is going to be a barrier to dispersal. And when I do that, it updates the simulation, and you see that canal breaks the connectivity between them. So now there's more of a discrete difference across that water gap because it's acting as a barrier to dispersal, right? And of course, this is all done at runtime, and it's all based on these simple ecological models with the terrain being used as input. Okay, so we get the congruence with geographical barriers, diversity gradients. And so if we take a bigger trip now, and we're actually going to a polar region, looks pretty cold. And here we just have two species. So one suited to the rocky upper slopes, one suited to the lower grassy slopes. And this is qualitatively similar to what we observe on Earth. If you go to a region that far north, you will not observe many species. And the next trip we're going to take is to the tropics. And again, you could traverse all this by land if you wanted to, observe a very gradual increase in biodiversity. If you had a few months to spare, get all the way to this location via land. Here we're in the tropics. We have 72 species here, and of course, none of them shared with our original location. Okay, so we get that latitudinal diversity gradient. And for this last demo here, I want to do something a little bit more ambitious. We're actually going to take a journey into outer space, because once you have this coalescence algorithm, it's very straightforward just to apply it to different planets. And in this case, so what you'll see, you've got all these stars here. Every star has its own planets. About 10% of those planets will support life. And on every planet, the diversity is generated by the same coalescence algorithm. And at the moment, I've just got it set up so that each planet is completely independent. But once you have this coalescence algorithm, it's quite powerful, and it would be straightforward to extend it so that you could have dispersal between different planets, even dispersal between different galaxies, and you would observe the characteristic patterns associated with that. So nearby planets would have more similar biodiversity and so on. As the designer, you could even choose whether there's just one point of origin of life in the whole universe and all life spread out from there, or you could have multiple points of origin of biodiversity of life, and you would have zones of interaction between them. Yeah, there'd be a lot of fun stuff you could do. All right, so we're going to go for a journey into this galaxy. We're going to go to an alien planet, and so I'm showing this here. Probably the easiest thing to imagine is, okay, open world games. But I think there's a lot of potential for novel types of educational game here too. I teach students about biodiversity patterns, how these mechanisms structure the biodiversity we see around us in nature. And if we can have some more interactive tools to do that, that can make it more engaging for them. Okay, so we've reached our destination. This is this alien planet with a few moons around it, and we're going to take a little trip down to that. Down to a mountain here, just at the edge of this ice sheet. And this is quite far south, so I'm using the same speciation rate function as a function of latitude, so diversity is quite low. The species here are these little blobs hanging onto the side of the cliff, right? So very, very simple, but just to make the point that we can get different biodiversity on different planets, but again, following these same mechanistic models.
So the same, presumably, being less ambitious now, the same could be to analyze the breakup of Pangea or the forming of Pangea, or the connections created by like discovery of America, where you have many more speciation links via ships.
Yeah, you mean by when people started moving stuff around?
Yeah, so that's speciation, like immigration links.
Yeah. Yeah, you could definitely explore that, and I think all right. So sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. This is just me summarizing how that works. So we have these just a few inputs, this individual based biodiversity model, and we get all these patterns as outputs. Possible extensions we could extend to non-equilibrium dynamics. So Greg, I think that's what you're talking about. I didn't explicitly mention it, but in the simulations I showed you, everything's run to equilibrium. So whatever the current landscape is, the simulation assumes it's been like that forever. But you can modify this quite easily to use different landscapes at different times. So you just tell the coalescence algorithm once it gets past a certain time, it should switch to a different landscape with maybe less foresty area or more connections between it or something. Multi-gene models, I talked about these Panama fish. One thing you note here is that these sister species look kind of similar. They have similar body shapes and similar stripe patterns. That's something you don't get from my simulation at the moment, because my simulation is essentially a one gene model where one gene determines the tree's color, its shape, the trunk color, and so on. But you could make multi-gene versions of this where you would have species that diverge more recently looking more similar. Applications, large-scale overworld games, virtual reality applications. I mentioned that. Design aid for smaller games, so just to take a bit of a load off the designer. The designer, of course, can come in afterwards and make modifications to whatever the algorithm had produced. Educational software. This is again going to what you were talking about, Greg. Biodiversity discovery. So you could follow the footsteps of Darwin and Wallace and other early naturalists, and go around the world discovering biodiversity. And that is an element of the game No Man's Sky, but I think it's a bit limited because, as I said, go to a continent on the other side of the planet, you're not going to observe systematic changes in biodiversity. Biogeographic puzzle solving. So I have colleagues who go out searching for new species, and they use clues like their knowledge of what sea level was 10,000, 100,000 years ago, where there were land bridges and so on. You could have students doing versions of this in a computer lab, looking at the landscape and trying to infer what the geographical history was, or vice versa, knowing something about the geographical history and kind of figure out where the new species could be. Effects of human impacts, so sea level rise, deforestation. Greg mentioned the movement of species across the world by people. You could explore this too. So in particular, thinking of that simulation I showed you where I was subsiding some of the land and watching the diversity change on that patch I was sitting on. That reminds me of this unfortunate rat species in Northern Australia, which was the first confirmed extinction due to climate change. And the reason it went extinct is just because the sea was consuming its the only island on which it lived, and so you could explore this kind of thing in a computer lab with an educational game based on these principles. So that's it. The summary, the 3 take-home points: 37% of species extinct in Singapore over the last 200 years. Biodiversity of most local scale ecological communities appears to be maintained by dispersal rather than niches, but that's certainly not the last word on that topic. And mechanistic biodiversity models have potential applications to gaming and virtual reality. And I kind of say this last one as like, I remember when I was a kid, games didn't have real physics models, and then they got real physics models, and suddenly your grenades bounce across the wall, off the wall in a more realistic way. I think once you have these models, it makes a lot of sense to use them. The results are probably better than when you get by hand, and they're very efficient and fast simulation methods. Okay, that's it. So I don't know. Should I take more questions, or how do you usually do this?
And so actually, I have one question. A few months ago, I think we had we had a number of speakers that do clear dynamics, which is like mathematical treatment of human history. And a lot of this biodiversity mirrors the human social diversity, except that the immigration things are a bit more complicated. You have like step warriors that can move faster and actually displace others. But a lot of the basic structure seems very similar.
Yeah, I don't know the research you're talking about, but I can imagine it's similar. I mean, in the end, you have dispersal processes. You have in human societies, maybe they're not called niches, but you have selections of different types over others. You have speciation, new types emerging, and many of the models I use are mathematically identical or very similar to ones used in population genetics. So studying the spread of genes within a population, and that could be a human population. So there's a consistent mathematical framework that applies across many of these fields.
It makes sense. Are there other questions in the call? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, very interesting studies. And one question, both I think relevant to the empirical studies and the gaming simulation. Do you include disturbances? It could be either some irregular or could be some seasonal disturbance. Irregular, like maybe wildfire, and seasonal, like a flood.
Yeah. So when I was showing the predictions of the neutral model, I mentioned that one of the things that doesn't predict very well is fluctuations in species abundances over time. So if we look at the real forest, we see these huge fluctuations over just a few years or a few decades. One species will go from being very common to not so common, or rare species will increase dramatically. And we attribute those changes to temporal changes in the environment. So as you said, it could be a wildfire, or it could just be a drought or a storm, or you could have elephants coming through, or some pest outbreak. And so to capture those fluctuations, we need to modify the model and allow different species to have different growth rates at different times. And we start off with just by modeling that phenomenologically, by which I mean we just have some distribution of growth rates, and at the start of every time period, each species takes a random draw from that distribution, and that's its growth rate. And the next time period, they each take another independent random draw. So we're not modeling what the actual environmental fluctuations are yet, but we know, for some species, we clearly know what those are, for others we don't. But we observe this phenomenon of bigger than neutral fluctuations across all species.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, yeah, thank you very much. This is a fascinating talk.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, have a great rest of your day.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye.